Some men buy flowers when they want a woman back. Jasper Blackwell bought her entire workplace just to make sure she couldn't run again. Welcome back, my dark romance lovers. Thank you for trusting this channel. Thank you all for your comments and likes. Tell me below which city you're watching from. Vivian Perez had worked at the Ashford Gallery for 8 years, and in all that time, she had never been summoned to an emergency meeting with less than an hour's notice. The email arrived at 4 in the afternoon, terse, unsettling. All senior staff. Conference room. 5 p.m. Mandatory. She arrived with 3 minutes to spare, heels clicking against marble as she made her way through the eerily quiet corridors. When she pushed open the glass door, the rest of the senior team was already seated, their faces tight with confusion and barely concealed anxiety. Vivian took her usual seat near the head of the table. She'd always prided herself on composure, but as she glanced around the room, she felt an unfamiliar prickle of unease. The door opened again. Their director of operations entered, expression grim. He didn't sit. He simply stood at the head of the table and cleared his throat. "I'll keep this brief," he said. "As of this morning, the Ashford Gallery has been sold. The new owner has requested to meet with all senior staff immediately." Vivian felt her stomach tighten. A hands-on owner was rarely good news. "Who is it?" someone asked. The director hesitated, and in that pause, Vivian felt the first whisper of something she couldn't quite name. "Jasper Blackwell," he said finally. The room erupted into murmurs. Vivian heard the name as if from a great distance, her mind struggling to process the information even as her body went completely still. Jasper Blackwell, a tech billionaire with no connection to the art world, no reason to buy a gallery in Manhattan. No reason except one. The door opened. Vivian didn't turn her head. She couldn't. She sat frozen, hands folded in her lap, gaze fixed on the polished table. But she felt him enter the room, the way you feel a shift in air pressure before a storm. And then she heard his voice. "Good evening." It was deeper than she remembered, smoother and more controlled, with none of the youthful intensity that had once made every word sound like a confession. This voice belonged to a man who was used to being listened to, a man who no longer had to raise his voice to command a room. It was calm and measured, and absolutely certain, and it sent a chill down Vivian's spine that had nothing to do with cold. She forced herself to look up. Jasper Blackwell stood at the head of the conference table, his hands resting lightly on the back of the chair the director had just vacated. His hair was shorter than it used to be, cut close on the sides and slightly longer on top, giving him an edge of refined severity. 5 years had sharpened his handsomeness into something more dangerous, more deliberately powerful, and he was looking directly at her. Vivian's breath caught in her chest. She told herself to look away, to break the connection before anyone else in the room noticed. But she couldn't. His eyes held hers with an intensity that made the rest of the room fade into insignificance, and for a moment, it was just the two of them, separated by 5 years and a table and 1,000 unspoken words. His expression gave nothing away. He simply looked at her the way someone might look at a piece of art they had once owned and lost and never stopped thinking about. Then he turned his attention to the rest of the room, and Vivian realized she had been holding her breath. "I know this transition has been sudden," Jasper said, his tone perfectly professional, perfectly controlled. "And I want to assure all of you that I have no intention of disrupting the excellent work you've been doing here." He spoke for several minutes about his vision for the gallery, about projected growth and strategic partnerships and digital integration, and Vivian heard almost none of it. She was too focused on the way his hands rested on the back of the chair, steady and composed. Too aware of the way his gaze kept drifting back to her, quick glances that no one else would notice, but that she felt like a physical touch. When he finished speaking, he invited questions. A few of her colleagues asked about timelines. Jasper answered each question with the kind of easy confidence that comes from always knowing more than everyone else in the room. And through it all, Vivian said nothing. She sat perfectly still, her expression carefully neutral, and prayed that no one would ask her opinion. Finally, the meeting ended. The staff filed out in small clusters, voices low and speculative. Vivian stood, gathering her notebook and her phone, moving toward the door with the rest of them. "Vivian," she stopped. She had almost made it out. Almost. Escaped. But of course he wouldn't let her. She turned slowly, aware that a few of her colleagues were glancing back with curiosity, and found Jasper still standing at the head of the table, his hands in his pockets now, his posture relaxed in a way that felt anything but casual. "Could you stay for a moment?" he asked. It wasn't really a question. Vivian nodded, not trusting her voice. The last of her colleagues left, the door clicking shut behind them, and then it was just the two of them in the empty conference room. The silence stretched out, heavy and expectant, until Jasper finally crossed the space between them with slow, deliberate steps. He stopped a few feet away from her, close enough that she could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the shadow of stubble along his jaw, close enough to smell his cologne, expensive, understated, unfamiliar. "Hello, Vivian," he said quietly. "It's been a while." She swallowed hard, her throat tight. 5 years. 5 years, he repeated, as if testing the weight of the words. His gaze moved over her face, slow and assessing, and she forced herself not to look away. "You look well." "So do you." He smiled then, just slightly, but there was no warmth in it. "I'm looking forward to working closely with the senior curator," he said, his tone perfectly cordial. "I have a feeling we're going to accomplish great things together." Vivian's pulse was racing now, her mind spinning through a dozen possible responses and discarding all of them. Finally, she managed, "I'm sure the gallery will benefit from your leadership." "I'm sure it will," Jasper agreed. He tilted his head slightly, studying her with that same unreadable intensity. "I'll see you tomorrow, Vivian. We have a lot to discuss." It wasn't until she was back in her office, door closed and locked behind her, that Vivian allowed herself to breathe. Her hands were shaking as she opened her laptop and pulled up her email. She didn't let herself think. She just typed, "Dear Mr. Blackwell, I am writing to formally submit my resignation, effective immediately." She hit send before she could change her mind. The response came less than a minute later. Automated, impersonal, and absolutely devastating. "Your resignation requires the owner's approval. A meeting has been scheduled for tomorrow at 9 a.m. Vivian stared at the screen, her heart pounding in her chest, and realized with perfect, horrible clarity that Jasper Blackwell hadn't bought this gallery by coincidence. He had bought it for her. Vivian didn't sleep that night. She lay in her bed staring at the ceiling, watching the shadows shift as car headlights swept past her window, and tried not to think about the last time she had seen Jasper Blackwell. But memory, she had learned, doesn't obey commands. It rises when it wants to, unbidden and relentless. And by 3 in the morning, she had given up fighting it. 5 years ago, she had been a different person. 40 years old, freshly divorced, and trying desperately to rebuild a sense of purpose. After 20 years of marriage had crumbled beneath the weight of mutual indifference. She had thrown herself into work after that, accepting every speaking engagement and consulting opportunity that came her way. That was how she had ended up at a business symposium in Boston, giving a keynote on the intersection of art and commerce to a room full of venture capitalists and tech entrepreneurs. She had noticed him immediately. He was sitting in the third row, younger than almost everyone else in the room, and he hadn't looked at his phone once during her entire presentation. He had just watched her, his attention so complete and unwavering that she had found herself speaking directly to him without meaning to, as if the rest of the audience had ceased to exist. Afterward, when the polite applause had faded and the crowd had begun to disperse toward the reception, he had approached her. Vivian remembered the confidence in his stride, the way he moved through the room like he belonged anywhere he chose to be. He was 25 years old, though she hadn't known that yet, and he looked at her like she was the most interesting thing he had ever seen. "That was brilliant," he had said, extending his hand. "Jasper Blackwell." She had shaken his hand, felt the warmth of his palm against hers, and tried not to notice how his gaze lingered on her face. "Thank you. I'm glad you found it useful." They talked through the reception, then coffee, then dinner at a restaurant neither had planned on. By the time they said goodnight, Vivian had known she was in trouble. The affair that followed had been everything she told herself she didn't want. Stolen weekends in hotel rooms, late-night phone calls that stretched until dawn, the kind of intense and all-consuming connection that made the rest of the world feel like background noise. Jasper had pursued her with a single-minded devotion that was both thrilling and terrifying. He didn't play games. He didn't pretend to be casual or detached. He simply wanted her, completely and without reservation, and he made no attempt to hide it. And God help her, she had wanted him too. Not just physically, though the chemistry between them had been undeniable and overwhelming, but intellectually, emotionally, in ways she hadn't expected and couldn't control. He made her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in years, maybe ever. He listened to her like her thoughts mattered, challenged her opinions without dismissing them, and looked at her like she was something rare and precious. But beneath all of that intensity, Vivian had felt the slow creep of fear. He was 25. She was 40. 15 years might not matter now, when he was brilliant and ambitious and utterly certain of what he wanted. But what about in 5 years? In 10? When he was 35 and she was 50? When the age gap stopped being an interesting footnote and started being a visible, undeniable fact? She had tortured herself with images of his eventual regret, the moment when he would wake up and realize he had wasted his youth on someone who couldn't give him the future he deserved. So she had ended it. Quickly, cleanly, like ripping off a bandage. She had written him a vague letter citing the age difference and timing, then disappeared. The memory of his face when he must have read that letter still haunted her. Vivian's alarm went off at 7, pulling her out of the past and back into the cold reality of the present. By the time she arrived at the gallery at 8:45, her hands had stopped shaking and her expression was carefully composed. Jasper's new office was on the top floor, in the space that had once belonged to Gregory Ashford. Vivian had only been up there a handful of times, in 8 years, and always for formal meetings or annual reviews. Now, as she stepped off the elevator and walked down the quiet hallway, she felt like she was walking toward an execution. His assistant, a polished woman in her 30s, who Vivian had never seen before, gestured toward the closed door. "He's expecting you. Go right in." Vivian knocked once, a formality more than anything else, and pushed open the door. The office had been transformed. Jasper's office was stark and modern, clean lines and windows overlooking the city. He was standing with his back to her, hands in his pockets, looking out at the skyline. He didn't turn when she entered. "Close the door, please," he said quietly. She did, the click of the latch unnaturally loud in the silence. Jasper turned then, and Vivian felt the full weight of his attention settle on her like a physical thing. In the harsh morning light, she could see the ways 5 years had changed him. The sharpness in his jaw, the confidence in his posture, the way he inhabited his own body like he had finally grown into it. He had built an empire in these years. "Sit," he said, gesturing to one of the chairs in front of his desk. It wasn't a request. Vivian sat, crossing her legs and folding her hands in her lap, and waited. Jasper moved around the desk and leaned against it, close enough that she had to tilt her head slightly to meet his eyes. The position was deliberate, she realized, a subtle assertion of control. "You left without a word," he said finally, his voice dangerously calm. "Just a letter and silence." Vivian swallowed hard. "I thought it was for the best." "For the best," he repeated, his tone flat. "You decided what was best for both of us, and then you disappeared. Do you have any idea what that did to me?" She wanted to look away but forced herself to hold his gaze. "I'm sorry." "Are you?" He leaned forward slightly. She caught the scent of his cologne. Woody, expensive, unfamiliar. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've spent the last 5 years pretending I never existed, and now you want to run again." This isn't about running, Vivian said, hating how defensive she sounded. This is about professionalism. You're my employer now. It's inappropriate. Jasper laughed, a short, humorless sound. Inappropriate. That's rich coming from you. He straightened, crossing his arms over his chest. I've never been appropriate where you're concerned, Vivian. I think we both know that. The air between them felt charged, dangerous. Vivian's pulse was racing now, her carefully constructed composure beginning to crack. What do you want from me, Jasper? He was quiet for a long moment, studying her with that same unreadable intensity. Then he moved closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and traced his fingertips along the edge of her jaw. You're still wearing the same perfume, he said softly, his voice dropping to something almost intimate. Jasmine and bergamot. I'd know it anywhere. Vivian's breath hitched. She should pull away. She should stand up and walk out of this office and never look back. But she couldn't move. She could only sit there, frozen, as his thumb brushed across her cheekbone with devastating gentleness. I missed it, he murmured. I missed you. You're even more beautiful than I remembered. His hand moved to cup her face, and Vivian felt 5 years of distance collapsing in the space between one heartbeat and the next. She could see the exact moment his gaze dropped to her mouth, could feel the shift in the air as the tension between them coiled tighter. He leaned in, and she knew with absolute certainty that he was going to kiss her, and she knew with equal certainty that she was going to let him. Their lips were an inch apart when Jasper stopped. He stayed there for one agonizing second, his breath warm against her skin, and then he pulled back. His hand dropped from her face, and he stepped away, putting distance between them with deliberate, controlled movements. When he spoke again, his voice was steady, betraying nothing of what had just almost happened. I'm not accepting your resignation, he said, moving back behind his desk, but I am offering you a promotion. Co-director. You'll report directly to me, oversee all major acquisitions and exhibitions, and have full creative control over the gallery's direction. Vivian blinked, trying to process the sudden shift. I don't understand. It's simple, Jasper said, settling into his chair with easy authority. You're the best curator in this city, and I want you working for me, not running away from me. And if I say no? His smile was cold and absolutely serious. Then I'll make sure every gallery in this city knows you're unavailable. I have that kind of reach now, Vivian. You know I do. She stared at him, stunned by the casual cruelty of the threat. You can't be serious. You have 48 hours to decide, he said, his tone perfectly professional once more. Stay and work with me, or spend the rest of your career wondering what you could have accomplished if you hadn't run away twice. The smile on his face didn't reach his eyes, and Vivian realized with cold, creeping dread that he meant every word. Vivian spent the next 48 hours trying to prove to herself that she had options. She updated her resume, reached out to contacts at other galleries, sent carefully worded emails to curators she had worked with over the years. The responses, when they came, were polite but vague. Positions that had been open suddenly weren't. Opportunities that seemed promising mysteriously evaporated. By the end of the second day, she understood with perfect, infuriating clarity what was happening. Jasper hadn't been bluffing. His influence reached further than she had imagined, deeper into the art world than should have been possible for someone who had only owned a gallery for a week. But then, Jasper had always been exceptional at getting what he wanted, and apparently 5 years of building an empire had only sharpened that particular skill. On the morning of the third day, Vivian walked into his office without knocking and dropped a single sheet of paper on his desk. I accept, she said, her voice clipped and professional. Jasper looked up from his laptop, and for just a moment she saw something flash across his face that might have been satisfaction. He picked up the paper, her signed acceptance of the co-director position, and set it aside without reading it. Good, he said simply. We start tomorrow. She should have walked out then, should have turned on her heel and left before he could say anything else, but she found herself rooted to the spot, held there by the weight of his gaze and the question she couldn't quite bring herself to ask. Jasper leaned back in his chair, studying her with that same maddening calm. "You're wondering if I blocked your other opportunities." It wasn't a question. Vivian lifted her chin. "Did you?" "Yes." The admission was so casual, so devoid of guilt or apology, that it took her breath away. "You had no right." "I had every right," Jasper countered, his tone still perfectly even. "You left me once without giving me a choice. I'm not making that mistake again." He stood, moving around the desk with the same predatory grace she remembered. "Welcome to your new position, Vivian. I think you're going to find it very rewarding." The first week was torture. Jasper kept her close, constantly. Meetings that could have been emails, consultations that required them to stand, side by side reviewing acquisition proposals, late evenings going over exhibition concepts when the rest of the staff had gone home. He was always professional, always appropriate in front of others. But when they were alone, the careful distance he maintained in public would evaporate like morning fog. He remembered everything. The artists she'd always wanted to feature, but never had the budget for. The small scar on her left hand from a childhood accident she'd mentioned once, years ago, in the dark. And he touched her. Nothing overt, nothing she could call him out on without sounding paranoid. His hand on her lower back as he guided her through a crowded room, his fingers brushing hers as he handed her documents. The way he would lean in close when discussing a particular piece, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, smell that expensive cologne that made her think of things she had no business thinking about. On Thursday evening, they were alone in the gallery's archive room, reviewing pieces for an upcoming exhibition. Vivian was bent over a catalog, trying desperately to focus on the provenance of a particular sculpture when she felt him move behind her. Not touching, but close. Too close. "You're still wearing that perfume," he said quietly, his voice rough in a way that made her stomach tighten. Vivian straightened, putting the catalog down with deliberate care. "I've worn this perfume for years." "I know." He was closer now, close enough that she could feel his breath against the back of her neck. "It used to drive me crazy, still does." She turned to face him, a mistake she realized immediately. He was standing less than a foot away, his expression unreadable but his eyes dark with something that made her pulse race. "Jasper, change it," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "Or don't. But if you keep wearing it, keep standing this close to me, smiling at me the way you used to, I'm not going to be responsible for what happens." "Nothing is going to happen," Vivian said, but even she could hear how unconvincing she sounded. Jasper's gaze dropped to her mouth, then slowly traveled down the line of her throat, the curve of her collarbone visible above her blouse. When he looked at her again, there was something dangerous in his eyes. "Keep telling yourself that. But we both know if I wanted to, I could bend you over that desk right now and make you take every inch of me just like I used to, and you wouldn't stop me." Heat flooded through her, sharp and undeniable. She should slap him. She should walk out. Instead, she heard herself whisper, "You're out of line." "I'm always out of line with you," he said, and then he stepped back, putting distance between them with visible effort. "That's never going to change." Friday evening brought a charity gala. Jasper had asked her to attend as the gallery's representative. She'd agreed, assuming it was professional. She realized her mistake the moment she stepped out of the car and saw him waiting at the entrance. Jasper was wearing a black tuxedo that made her forget to breathe. His hair was styled back, emphasizing the sharp angles of his face, and when he saw her, his expression shifted into something she couldn't quite read. Appreciation, maybe. Possession, definitely. He met her at the bottom of the steps, offering his arm with the kind of old-fashioned courtesy that should have felt out of place, but somehow didn't. "You look stunning," he said quietly, his gaze moving over the emerald green dress she had chosen, the way it hugged her curves before flowing to the floor. "Thank you," Vivian managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "I didn't realize you would be here." "Where else would I be?" His hand settled on her waist as he guided her inside. the touch proprietary and warm through the thin silk of her dress. "You didn't think I'd let you come alone, did you?" Jasper never left her side. He introduced her to donors and collectors, and the way he spoke about her made something twist in her chest. He praised her expertise, her vision, her instincts, and he did it with a quiet pride that felt entirely too intimate for a professional relationship. People watched them with barely concealed curiosity. Something in the way they moved together suggested a history no professional distance could hide. Midway through the evening, one of her former colleagues approached them, a woman Vivian had worked with years ago at another gallery. She smiled warmly at Vivian, then glanced at Jasper with obvious interest. "I didn't know you two were together." Before Vivian could respond, Jasper spoke. "We were," he said, his tone casual but certain. His hand tightened slightly on Vivian's waist. "We will be together again." The woman's eyebrows rose, but she was too polite to press further. She made her excuses and drifted away, leaving Vivian staring at Jasper in stunned silence. "You can't say things like that," she hissed once they were alone. "Why not?" He turned to face her fully, his expression maddeningly calm. "It's the truth." "It's not the truth, it's inevitable," he finished for her. "You can fight it all you want, Vivian, but we both know how this ends." She wanted to argue, to tell him he was delusional, but the words wouldn't come. Because somewhere deep down, in a place she refused to acknowledge, she was afraid he might be right. When the evening ended, Jasper insisted on driving her home. They drove in silence, tension thick between them. When he pulled up in front of her building, Vivian reached for the door handle immediately, desperate to escape before something happened that she couldn't take back. But Jasper's hand on her wrist stopped her. "Wait," he said quietly. She turned to look at him, and the expression on his face made her breath catch. He looked the way he used to look at her in the early days of their relationship, like she was something precious and fragile and entirely his. He got out of the car and came around to open her door, offering his hand to help her out. She took it without thinking, and then he was walking her to her door, his hand warm against hers, and she knew she should pull away but couldn't quite bring herself to do it. At her door, she fumbled for her keys, achingly aware of him behind her. When she turned to say goodnight, the words died at the way he was looking at her. "I've waited 5 years, Vivian," he said, his voice low and rough with barely restrained emotion. "I can wait longer if I have to, but I won't wait quietly." He leaned in, and for one breathless moment, she thought he was going to kiss her. Her eyes started to close, her body leaning toward him without conscious thought. But instead of her mouth, his lips brushed against her cheek, soft and deliberate. She felt the warmth of his breath, the press of his mouth against her skin, and then his tongue traced a slow line along her cheekbone, tasting the makeup there, erasing it. His lips moved closer to the corner of her mouth, so close she could feel them brushing against hers without quite making contact, a promise and a threat all at once. And then he pulled back, his eyes dark and knowing as he looked at her. "Good night, Vivian," he said softly. He turned and walked away, his footsteps steady and unhurried, leaving her standing in the doorway with her heart racing and her hands shaking so badly she could barely close the door behind her. She leaned against it, eyes closed, and tried to convince herself that she wasn't already lost. Vivian told herself she was moving on. That was what well-adjusted, rational adults did when faced with impossible situations. They moved forward. They made healthy choices. They didn't spend every waking moment thinking about men who had bought entire galleries just to keep them close. She tried dating someone age-appropriate, safe, attentive, but every touch only reminded her of Jasper. Jasper said nothing about her attempts to date. No questions, no jealousy. He simply continued working beside her with maddening calm. His silence was more unnerving than jealousy would have been. 2 weeks later, Vivian worked late cataloging a new sculpture collection. She had volunteered partly because it needed doing, partly to avoid going home alone with her thoughts. She was in the main exhibition hall, kneeling beside a particularly intricate bronze piece, when she heard the sound of the front door opening. Vivian's heart stuttered. The gallery was locked. She had secured it herself, which meant whoever had just entered had their own key, and there was only one person other than herself who had been given unrestricted access. She stood slowly, her pulse quickening as footsteps approached through the darkened corridors. Then, Jasper appeared in the doorway, tie loosened, top button undone. "You're working late," he observed, his tone conversational. Vivian forced herself to breathe normally. "So are you, apparently." He moved into the room with that same easy confidence, his gaze sweeping over the sculptures she had been cataloging before settling on her. "I saw the lights on from the street. Thought I'd check to make sure everything was secure." "Everything is fine," she said, hearing the defensive edge in her voice and hating herself for it. "I don't need supervision. I never said you did." He stopped a few feet away from her, hands in his pockets, and the careful distance felt more dangerous than proximity would have. "How's Elliot?" The question landed like a slap. "That's not your business." "Probably not," Jasper agreed. "But I'm curious. Is he everything you thought you wanted? Safe? Appropriate?" "He's a good man," Vivian said, lifting her chin. "I'm sure he is." Jasper tilted his head slightly, studying her with that unnerving intensity. "Does he make you feel the way I did? Does he know exactly how you like to be touched, where you're most sensitive, what you sound like when you're about to—" "Stop!" Vivian cut him off, her voice sharp. The air between them felt charged, electric. "You don't get to do this." "Do what?" "Control everything. My job prospects, my workspace, now my personal life. You're acting like you own me." "You manipulated my career," she shot back. "Made it impossible to work anywhere else. You don't get to decide my life." "I'm not deciding anything," Jasper said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I'm just making sure you can't run from the choice. There's a difference." "That's not a choice. That's coercion." "Is it?" He took a step closer, and Vivian found herself backing up instinctively until her spine hit the wall behind her. He stopped just short of touching her, one hand braced against the wall beside her head. "Because from where I'm standing, you had 5 years to build a life without me. To move on, find someone else, forget I ever existed. And yet, here you are, working beside me every day, wearing the same perfume you wore when we were together, looking at me like you used to when you thought I wasn't watching." "You're imagining things," Vivian whispered, but even she could hear how unconvincing it sounded. "Am I?" His free hand came up, hovering near her face without quite touching, and she felt the heat of him like a physical presence. "Tell me you don't think about it. About us. Tell me you don't lie awake at night remembering exactly how good we were together." She couldn't. The words stuck in her throat, trapped behind 5 years of carefully constructed walls that were crumbling faster than she could rebuild them. Silence stretched between them, heavy with everything unsaid. For the first time, she saw his control crack. When he spoke again, his voice was raw in a way that made her chest ache. "Why did you really leave, Vivian?" The question hung in the air between them, devastating in its simplicity. She opened her mouth to answer, to give him the explanation he deserved, but the words wouldn't come. How could she explain that she had been terrified of the intensity of what they had? That she had convinced herself she was protecting him from a future he would regret? That she had been so consumed by fear of eventual loss that she had chosen to lose him on her own terms instead? But before she could find the words, before she could force herself to be that honest, Jasper's hand dropped from the wall. He stepped back, putting distance between them with visible effort, and the shuttered expression that fell over his face felt like a door closing. "Forget I asked," he said quietly. And then he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing through the empty gallery, leaving her standing alone in the darkness, with her heart racing and the answer trapped behind her lips. The memory of that night 5 years ago had become almost mythological in her mind, polished smooth by time and regret, until she could barely remember what had been real and what she had constructed afterward to justify her choices. But lying alone in her bed at 3 a.m, unable to sleep, she forced herself to remember it exactly as it had happened. She had been 40 years old, and Jasper had been 25, and the intensity of what they had together had terrified her in ways she hadn't known how to articulate. He had looked at her like she was the answer to questions he hadn't known he was asking. He had loved her with a completeness that felt like being seen under a microscope, every flaw and fear exposed and somehow still found worthy. And that devotion, that absolute certainty he had in what they were building together, had made her feel like she was standing at the edge of a cliff with no way to know if she was about to fly or fall. She'd imagined the future obsessively, him at 35, her at 50. She saw him waking up one morning and realizing he'd wasted his youth. The fear consumed her, so she made the decision for both of them, a vague letter citing the age difference. Then she disappeared and changed her number. Thursday afternoon, she ended things with the museum director. He took it well. She knew exactly what she was looking for now. That evening, she stood outside Jasper's building, staring up at the glass tower. She should go home. She didn't. But she had spent 5 years running, and she was so desperately tired of it. The doorman waved her through. The elevator ride felt both endless and too short. When the doors opened directly into his apartment, she stepped out into a space that was all clean lines and floor-to-ceiling windows, the city spreading out below like a carpet of lights. Jasper was standing by the windows with his back to her, a glass of whiskey in his hand, still wearing his work clothes, though his jacket had been discarded and his shirt sleeves were rolled up to his elbows. He turned when he heard the elevator, and the surprise on his face gave way almost immediately to something more guarded. "Vivian," he said quietly, "I wasn't expecting you." "I know." She stepped further into the apartment, her hands clenched at her sides. "I need to talk to you." He gestured to the seating area with his glass, an invitation without words. But Vivian stayed standing, needing the distance, needing to say this before she lost her nerve. "I came to tell you this is impossible, that you need to let me go. We can't keep pretending there's a version where we end up together. You deserve someone without 5 years of guilt." Jasper set his glass down on the side table, with careful precision. "Are you finished?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. "Good." He moved toward her slowly. She didn't back away. "You left because you were afraid I'd leave you first. You convinced yourself I'd regret choosing you. So you made the choice for both of us." Vivian's breath caught. "That's not." "Yes, it is." His voice was gentle but implacable. "You were the only real thing in my life, Vivian. The only person who saw me as something more than my potential, or my family name, or what I could do for them. And you vanished like I meant nothing. Like what we had meant nothing." "It meant everything," she whispered, and felt something crack inside her chest. That was the problem. For the first time, she saw the hurt beneath his control, in his eyes, his clenched fists, the tremor in his voice. "I would never have left you," he said, raw and honest. "I would never have woken up and regretted choosing you. You didn't give me the chance to prove that." Tears were sliding down her face now, hot and unstoppable. "I was so scared, Jasper. You were so young and so certain, and I kept waiting for you to realize you could do better, that you should do better." There was no better. He closed the remaining distance between them, his hands coming up to frame her face with devastating gentleness. "There was only you. There's only ever been you." She knew she should tell him, about his family, about the money, about all the things that would make this moment impossible to sustain. But the words wouldn't come. Not when he was looking at her like that, like she was something precious he had thought he'd lost forever. "There's something you don't know," she managed, but it came out broken, barely audible. "Then tell me." His thumb brushed away her cheek, his touch achingly tender. "Whatever it is, just tell me." She opened her mouth to confess everything, but what came out instead was, "I did love you, Jasper." Past tense, present tense. I don't know anymore. I just know that leaving you was the biggest mistake of my life, and I don't know how to fix it. Something shifted in his expression, something that looked almost like hope, and it was the most devastating thing she had ever seen. "Past tense?" His voice cracked on the question. She couldn't answer. couldn't force the words past the lump in her throat. And then suddenly, he was kissing her, and all the careful distance she had maintained, all the walls she had built, came crashing down in the space of a heartbeat. The kiss was nothing like the restrained, controlled man he had been for the past few weeks. It was desperate and raw, 5 years of longing breaking through every defense he had erected. His hands tangled in her hair, angling her head to deepen the kiss, and she made a sound somewhere between a sob and a moan as she surrendered completely to the feeling of finally being this close to him again. She kissed him back with equal desperation, her hands fisting in his shirt, pulling him closer, even though there was no space left between them. He tasted like whiskey and regret, and something that was uniquely him. And she had forgotten how perfectly they fit together, how his body against hers felt like the answer to a question she had been asking her entire life. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Vivian realized she was crying in earnest now. Her heart ached. She was past this age of crying for someone younger than her. Jasper rested his forehead against hers, his hand still cradling her face, like she was something fragile and infinitely precious. "Don't leave again," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "Please, Vivian. Whatever it is you're not telling me, whatever you think will make me walk away, just don't leave again." She wanted to promise, wanted to tell him she would stay, that they would figure it out together, that nothing else mattered but this moment and the way he was looking at her. But the weight of what she was hiding felt like a stone in her chest, and she knew with horrible certainty that when he learned the truth, this moment would become just another thing she had taken from him. "I have to go," she said, pulling away from him, even though every cell in her body screamed at her to stay. "Vivian, I'm sorry." She was backing toward the elevator, her vision blurred with tears. "I'm so sorry." The last thing she saw before the elevator doors closed was Jasper standing frozen in the middle of his apartment, his jaw tight and his hands clenched at his sides, looking like she had just broken him all over again. She made it to the ground floor before she collapsed against the elevator wall, her fingers touching her lips where he had kissed her, tasting salt from her own tears. Above her, 30 floors up, Jasper stood in the same spot where she had left him, replaying her words over and over. "There's something you don't know. What could possibly be worse than what she had already told him? Drop a heart in the comments if you love a possessive billionaire who can't let go. Let's see how many of us are here for the obsession." Vivian didn't sleep that night. She replayed the kiss, his whispered, "Don't leave again," the devastated look on his face as she left anyway. She arrived early Friday, exhausted and hollowed out. She moved through work like an automaton, not thinking about what happened next. Whether she should go back to Jasper's apartment and tell him everything, or whether she should do what she had always done and run before the truth could destroy them both. The envelope arrived at 11:30, plain manila, no return address. Something about it made her stomach turn before she opened it. Inside were photocopies, bank statements showing a wire transfer of $2 million deposited into her account 5 years ago, a contract on Blackwell Industries letterhead, dense with legal language, and her signature at the bottom, and photographs. Her sitting across from Jasper's father and older brother in a restaurant she barely remembered, her expression tight with desperation and something that looked horribly like defeat. Vivian's hands were shaking as she spread the documents across her desk. She hadn't looked at these papers in 5 years, had shoved them into the back of a drawer and tried to pretend they didn't exist. But here they were, resurrected like ghosts, every damning detail preserved in black and white. The memory returned in fragments. 3 days after deciding to leave, his family found her. They knew about her debt. They made their offer. $2 million to disappear from their son's life permanently. No contact, no explanation beyond whatever vague dismissal she chose to include in her goodbye. They had presented it as a kindness, a way to solve both their problems at once. She would be free of her debt. Jasper would be free to find someone more appropriate, someone who wouldn't hold him back or become a liability to the family name. She had wanted to refuse, but her mother was dying, and they made it seem like mercy. She signed. The contract included an NDA and a penalty clause. If she ever contacted Jasper again, she'd owe triple the amount. $6 million she didn't have. She had taken the money, paid off her mother's medical bills, and sent Jasper the letter the next day. Then she had spent 5 years trying to convince herself she had made the right choice. Now, staring at the evidence of her betrayal spread across her desk, Vivian understood exactly what was happening. Someone in the Blackwell family had sent this to her as a warning. She was getting too close to Jasper again, threatening whatever carefully constructed future they had planned for him, and they wanted her to remember the terms of their agreement. Stay away or pay the price. But if they had sent it to her, had they also sent it to him? The thought made her nauseous. She gathered the papers with shaking hands, shoving them back into the envelope, and tried to think through the panic that was threatening to overwhelm her. Maybe they hadn't told him. Maybe this was just meant for her, a private reminder to back off before things went any further. She almost believed it until 7:30 that evening, when there was a knock on her apartment door. Vivian knew it was Jasper before she opened the door. She considered not answering, hiding like the coward she'd been 5 years ago, but she had run enough. So she opened the door. Jasper stood in the hallway holding an envelope identical to the one she had received. His expression was carefully blank, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the tightness around his eyes, the way his jaw was clenched so hard she could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. "Someone sent this to my office," he said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "Tell me this isn't real." Vivian couldn't speak, couldn't force the words past the knot of dread and shame that had lodged itself in her throat. She just stood there, frozen, and watched as understanding dawned across his face. "It's real," he said slowly, like he was testing the weight of the words. "You took money from my family. $2 million to disappear from my life. Jasper, how long after I told you I loved you did you take their money? My mother was dying. I had debt I couldn't pay. They cornered me, made it sound like I was doing you a favor. And you believed them." His laugh was harsh and completely devoid of humor. "You actually believed that I would be better off without you. Or maybe you just wanted to believe it because it made taking the money easier? That's not fair." "Fair?" He threw the envelope onto her coffee table, photographs and bank statements scattering across the surface. "You want to talk about fair? I spent 5 years thinking I wasn't good enough for you, that I had done something wrong, pushed too hard, loved you too intensely. I spent 5 years wondering what I could have done differently to make you stay. And the entire time, you were paid to leave. You took money to walk away from me." Tears were streaming down Vivian's now. "I'm sorry." "God, Jasper, I'm so sorry. I was desperate and scared, and I convinced myself it was the right thing to do. I told myself I was protecting you." "Protecting me," he repeated flatly. "By lying to me. By letting me think I meant so little to you that you could just disappear without a word. By taking money from the people I've spent my entire adult life trying to prove wrong." His voice cracked, just slightly, and the sound of it broke something in her chest. "Was any of it real, Vivian? The things you said, the way you looked at me. Was I just a payday?" "Of course it was real," she sobbed. "I loved you. I still don't." The word came out sharp and cutting. "Don't you dare tell me you love me. Not now. Not after this." He turned toward the door, and panic seized her. This was it. This was the moment she lost him forever, and there was nothing she could say that would make it right. She had taken money to leave him once, and now the truth of it was destroying whatever fragile second chance they might have had. "Please," she whispered. "Please let me explain. There's more you don't know. Things I need to tell you." Jasper stopped with his hand on the doorknob. For a moment she thought he might turn around, might give her the chance to tell him about the pregnancy, about the miscarriage, about all the ways she had been punished for her choice. But when he spoke, his voice was distant and cold in a way that felt worse than anger. I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear anything else you have to say. You took money to leave me, Vivian. That's all I need to know." The door closed behind him with devastating finality, and Vivian collapsed onto her couch, her body racked with sobs she couldn't control. The silence was worse than anger. In the days following the confrontation, Jasper became a ghost in Vivian's professional life. He was still there, technically, still the owner of the gallery and still her direct supervisor, but he might as well have been operating from another country. Every communication came through his assistant, polite and impersonal emails about scheduling and approvals that read like they had been written by a corporate algorithm. He stopped attending their regular strategy meetings, sending his COO in his place, with instructions that were clear and comprehensive and completely devoid of any personal touch. Vivian had expected rage. She had braced herself for confrontation, for accusations, for the kind of explosive anger that would at least prove he still felt something. But this calculated absence was so much worse. It felt like erasure, like he was methodically removing her from his life one careful step at a time, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. She tried to explain in carefully worded emails. He never responded. Not once. 2 weeks later, she learned Jasper had been having dinner with his father and brother. The fact that he was willingly sitting down to private dinners with them now could only mean one thing. Guilt became her constant companion. She replayed every moment, searching for the cowardice that made her take the money. 3 weeks later, she wrote him a letter. Not an email, actual pen on paper. She explained everything. Her mother, the debt, the fear. She explained that she had been too proud to ask her ex-husband for help, too stubborn to admit she couldn't handle it alone. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She simply told him the truth, all of it, laid bare on paper, in a way she had never been brave enough to do in person. She left it with his assistant. 4 days later, it came back. Unopened, the seal unbroken, her handwriting on the front as pristine as the moment she had written it. There was no note, no explanation, just the envelope sitting on her desk when she arrived at work one morning, like a judgment rendered without trial. A week later, his assistant summoned her with documents needing signatures. She could have left them at the desk. But she didn't. The office door was still open. Jasper was sitting behind his desk, his attention focused on his laptop screen, and he didn't look up when she entered. Vivian closed the door behind her and crossed to the desk in silence, setting the documents down in front of him with hands that were miraculously steady. He pulled the papers toward him and began signing them with mechanical precision, his expression blank and his movements controlled. He still didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge her presence beyond the necessary interaction of signing his name on the designated lines. When he finished, he pushed the documents back across the desk toward her without a word. She picked them up, her fingers brushing the edge of the desk where his hand had rested moments before. She wanted to say something, wanted to apologize again, or beg him to listen, or tell him about another important thing. But his silence was so absolute. So she turned and walked to the door, documents clutched against her chest like armor that had already failed to protect her. The door closed with a soft click. Vivian made it to the elevator before she had to lean against the wall. Inside his office, Jasper sat motionless at his desk, staring at nothing, his hands clenched into fists, so tight his knuckles had gone white. Vivian stood outside Jasper's building for 20 minutes before she found the courage. Nearly 11 at night. She could still turn around. But she'd carried this secret for 5 years. The weight was finally too much. The doorman recognized her and waved her through without question, probably assuming she had been invited. The elevator ride to the penthouse felt like ascending to her own execution, each floor bringing her closer to a moment she couldn't take back. When the doors opened directly into his apartment, she stepped out into darkness, broken only by the city lights streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Jasper was sitting on the couch facing the windows, a glass of something amber in his hand, still wearing his work clothes, though it was clear from the exhaustion in his posture that he had been home for hours. He turned when he heard the elevator, and the surprise on his face gave way to something harder, more guarded. "Vivian." Her name sounded like an accusation. It's late. I know. Her voice came out smaller than she, then, intended. I need to talk to you. Please. For a long moment she thought he would refuse, would tell her to leave and never come back. And part of her wished he would, because it would be so much easier than what she was about to do. But then he gestured toward the chair across from him, a silent invitation that felt more like a concession than genuine welcome. She sat, leaving the width of the coffee table between them like a demilitarized zone. The distance felt both necessary and unbearable. Jasper took a slow sip of his drink, watching her over the rim of the glass with those dark eyes that used to look at her with such tenderness and now held nothing but careful blankness. I'm listening, he said finally, when the silence had stretched too long. Vivian folded her hands in her lap to keep them from shaking. My mother was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer 6 months before I met you, she began, forcing the words out before she could lose her nerve. The treatment was experimental and not covered by insurance. I took out loans, maxed out credit cards, sold everything I could. But it wasn't enough. It was never enough. Jasper's expression didn't change, but she saw his grip tighten on the glass. By the time we were together, I was drowning in debt. $200,000 and climbing. My mother was dying, and I couldn't even afford to keep her comfortable, and I was too proud to ask anyone for help, especially not my ex-husband. So you took money from my family instead, Jasper said, his tone carefully neutral. Yes. She forced herself to meet his eyes. They found me 3 days after I decided to leave you. I don't know how they knew about us, but they did. Your father and your brother took me to lunch and made me an offer. $2 million to disappear from your life and never contact you again. And you accepted. Not immediately. She heard the defensiveness in her voice and hated it. I told them no at first. But they didn't just offer me money, Jasper. They made it very clear that I was a liability to you, that I would hold you back, damage your reputation, become a burden you'd eventually resent. They painted a picture of your future with me in it, and it was ugly. And I believed them. Jasper set his glass down with deliberate care. You believed that I would resent you. I believed that eventually you would wake up and realize you'd wasted your youth on someone who couldn't give you what you deserved. So yes, I took their money. I paid off my mother's medical bills. I made sure she could die with dignity instead of in pain and debt. And then I wrote you that letter and disappeared because I convinced myself I was doing you a favor. The words hung in the air between them, and Vivian felt the familiar weight of guilt settle over her shoulders, like a cloak she had worn for so long it had become part of her skin. She waited for him to say something, to tell her she was right to feel guilty, that nothing she had just explained changed what she had done. But he just sat there, his jaw tight and his hands clenched on his thighs, and said nothing at all. The silence stretched until it became its own kind of torture. Vivian took a shaky breath, knowing that what came next would either break something irreparable between them or give them the smallest chance at understanding. There's something else, she said quietly. Something I should have told you years ago. Jasper's eyes snapped to hers, and she saw wariness there, a bracing for another blow. What else could there possibly be? She closed her eyes, unable to look at him while she said the words. 3 weeks after I left you, I took a pregnancy test. It was positive. The silence that followed was absolute. When she finally opened her eyes, Jasper was staring at her with an expression she couldn't read, his face gone pale in the dim light. I was pregnant, she continued, the words coming faster now because if she stopped, she would never be able to start again. I was terrified and alone, and I couldn't contact you without violating the NDA your family made me sign. The contract said, if I reached out to you for any reason, I would owe triple the original amount. $6 million. Money I didn't have and never would. She saw him open his mouth to speak, and rushed on before he could interrupt. I wanted to keep the baby. God, Jasper, I wanted it so much. It was the only piece of you I had left, the only thing they couldn't take from me. I started planning how I would manage, how I would explain it when they were old enough to ask about their father. Her voice cracked, and she had to pause to collect herself. Jasper hadn't moved, hadn't made a sound, but she could see the tension in every line of his body. At 11 weeks, I started bleeding, she whispered. I was at work. I barely made it to the hospital. They did an ultrasound and told me there was no heartbeat. I was alone in that hospital room. No one to call, no one to tell. The nurse gave me the ultrasound photo. I just sat there alone. She looked at Jasper through her blurry face. His control had finally shattered. His hands shook, jaw clenched so tight, she could see the muscle jumping. He stood abruptly, turning away from her, so she couldn't see his face, and she heard the harsh sound of his breathing in the darkness. You went through that alone, he said. And it wasn't a question. It was a statement of unbearable fact, and the rawness in his voice made something crack open in her chest. Yes, she whispered. He ran his hand through his hair, the gesture almost violent, and exhaled a breath that sounded like it had been torn from somewhere deep inside him. I would have been there, his voice broke on the words, if I'd known. I would have fought for you, for us, for... He couldn't finish. The sentence hung incomplete between them, and Vivian watched as his shoulders began to shake with emotion he was trying desperately to contain. I'm so sorry, she said through her tears. I'm so sorry I didn't tell you. I'm sorry I went through it alone. I'm sorry I lost our baby, and you never even knew they existed. Another long silence, this one heavy with 5 years of accumulated loss and grief and all the ways they had failed each other. When Jasper finally turned back to face her, his eyes were red but dry, and the devastation in his expression was so raw it was almost painful to witness. I need you to leave, he said quietly. The words hit her like a physical blow. Jasper? Not because I don't... He stopped, his jaw working as he struggled to find the right words. I just need time. Please, Vivian. I need to process this. All of it. And I can't do that with you here. She wanted to argue, to tell him they should face this together, that she had already spent 5 years processing alone, and it had nearly destroyed her. But she could see in his face that he was barely holding himself together, and the least she could do was give him the space he was asking for. So she stood on shaking legs and walked to the elevator without another word. The doors closed between them, and the last thing she saw was Jasper standing in the middle of his dark apartment, one hand pressed against his chest, like he was trying to physically hold himself together. Vivian made it as far as the hallway outside his door before her legs gave out. Inside the apartment, Jasper stood frozen for a long moment, staring at the space where Vivian had been. Then his legs buckled, and he sank onto the couch, his head dropping into his hands as the first sob tore through him. And when the tears finally stopped, he sat in the dark, staring at nothing. The email arrived Tuesday morning. Administrative leave notice. Vivian stared at it for a full minute, dread pooling in her stomach. Effective immediately, 2-week paid administrative leave. Vivian set her phone down. This was what she had expected, what she deserved. The days that followed were worse than working beside him in silence. At the gallery, she'd had structure, distraction. At home alone, there was only time and her own thoughts. She tried to fill the hours. Books she didn't retain, walks she didn't notice, elaborate meals she threw away. And through it all, her phone remained silent. No calls, no texts. Nothing to indicate that Jasper was thinking about her at all. What Vivian didn't know, couldn't know, was that Jasper was thinking about little else. He had spent the first 48 hours after she left his apartment in a kind of controlled fury, his grief hardening into rage, directed at the people who had orchestrated this tragedy. His father and brother had paid Vivian to disappear, had trapped her with an NDA that made it impossible to reach out to him, and in doing so, they had stolen not just his relationship, but the chance to know about his own baby. The board meeting where he removed his father as chairman was brief and brutal. The vote was unanimous, respect and fear in equal measure. His brother's trust fund access was terminated with a single phone call to the family attorneys. Jasper didn't explain his reasoning, didn't justify the decision, simply made it clear that the arrangement was permanent and non-negotiable. These actions were swift, quiet, irreversible. The satisfaction was hollow. None of it changed the fundamental problem. Vivian had gone through the worst alone, and he hadn't been there. She had carried 5 years of grief and guilt, and he hadn't been there. And now he didn't know how to be there. The enormity of what had been taken from them felt too large, and he was terrified of making it worse. So he gave her space and told himself it was the right thing to do, even as the distance felt like it was killing them both. Day 12, she made a decision. She booked a short trip away, not running, just distance, to figure out what came next. Her last evening, she packed mechanically, a half-filled suitcase, books she wouldn't read, her resignation letter on the counter, written but not submitted. The knock came while she was packing, nearly 10 at night. For a moment she considered not answering, but something in the knock's rhythm made her heart stutter. She crossed to the door and opened it without checking the peephole, and there was Jasper. He looked terrible, unshaven, hair disheveled, eyes shadowed with exhaustion. He clearly hadn't been sleeping. He was wearing jeans and a wrinkled button-down shirt, and he looked more undone than she had ever seen him. They stared at each other for a long moment, and Vivian's hands tightened on the doorframe to keep herself steady. "Don't leave," Jasper said, his voice raw and stripped of the control he usually wore like armor. "Not again. Please." The words hit her like a physical impact. She swallowed hard against the tightness in her throat. "You told me to go. I was wrong." He took a step closer, and she could see the desperation in his face now, barely contained. "I needed time to process, but I don't need more time. I just need you to not disappear again." Vivian gestured helplessly at the suitcase. "I was just going away for a few days. To clear my head, I wasn't—" "I know," he interrupted. "I know you weren't running. Not this time. But I spent the last 12 days trying to figure out what to say to you, and the only thing I keep coming back to is that I can't do this without you. The grief, the anger, trying to make sense of everything that happened. I can't carry it alone, and you shouldn't have to either." His voice cracked on the last words, and Vivian felt something break open in her chest. 5 years of carefully maintained walls finally crumbling completely. "I don't know how to fix this," she whispered. "I don't know how we come back from everything that happened." "Neither do I," Jasper admitted. "But I know we don't figure it out by staying apart." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and when she didn't, his hand found hers. His fingers were warm and trembling slightly, and the touch felt like coming home after being lost for years. "I'm not asking you to have all the answers, Vivian. I'm just asking you to stop leaving." She looked down at their joined hands, feeling the weight of his words settle into her bones. She had spent 5 years running from the possibility of loss, and all it had brought her was the certainty of it. Maybe it was time to try standing still instead. "Okay," she said softly. "I'll stay." Jasper's exhale was shaky with relief. He stepped into her apartment, closing the door behind him, and pulled her into his arms with a desperation that matched her own. Vivian buried her face against his chest and felt his heart racing beneath her cheek, proof that he was just as terrified and uncertain as she was. They stood there, holding each other like survivors of a shipwreck. For the first time in 12 days, she could finally breathe. "I fired my father," Jasper said finally, his voice rough from exhaustion. "Removed him from the board. Cut off my brother's trust. I did it 2 days after you told me about the baby." Vivian's breath caught. "Jasper, I need you to understand something." He turned to face her fully. "I'm not angry you took the money. I'm angry I wasn't there when you needed me, that my family trapped you, that you faced it all alone." His voice cracked, and Vivian felt something break open in her chest. "I'm so sorry. I should have found some way to tell you." "How?" He moved closer until their knees almost touched. They backed you into a corner. And then you lost our kid alone, and He stopped, jaw working. I keep thinking about you in that hospital room, alone, and I wasn't there. The tears came then, 5 years of grief finally breaking through. Jasper pulled her against his chest. His hand moved in slow circles on her back. You should have told me, he said quietly when her sobs subsided. I couldn't. The NDA, your family, the shame. I convinced myself I didn't deserve to tell you. Jasper tilted her face up, thumbs brushing away her tears. None of that mattered. The money, the contract. You mattered. You should never have carried that alone. She searched his face for anger, but found only grief. I never stopped loving you, not for one single day. Even when I tried to move on, you were always there. His expression softened. Then stop punishing yourself. Stop running. Stop deciding for both of us what we can and can't survive. What if I hurt you again? What if I'm still too afraid? You won't, because I'm not letting you carry anything alone ever again. Whatever comes next, we face it together. No more secrets. No more running. What do we do now? She asked, voice small. Jasper rested his forehead against hers. We start over. But this time, you don't get to leave. I'm scared. So am I. He smiled slightly. But I'm more scared of losing you again. And then he was kissing her, slow and deliberate. Not the desperate kiss from weeks ago. This was a promise, a beginning. His lips moved against hers with careful reverence. When he pulled back, the question in his gaze was clear. She answered by taking his hand and leading him toward her bedroom. For the first time in 5 years, fear felt like something they could survive. In her bedroom, the city lights cast soft shadows across the walls. Jasper's hands moved to her face with devastating gentleness, his thumbs tracing the lines of her cheekbones like he was memorizing her all over again. Are you sure? He whispered, even as his fingers trembled against her skin. I've never been more sure of anything, Vivian answered, and kissed him. This time there was no desperation, no frantic urgency, just the slow, deliberate exploration of two people who had spent 5 years apart and were determined to savor every moment of coming back together. His lips traced the line of her throat, while her hands found the buttons of his shirt, each small revelation of skin feeling like a gift unwrapped with care. When he paused to reach for protection, the mundane interruption somehow made everything more real, more intentional. This wasn't a fantasy or a fever dream. This was a choice they were both making with clear eyes and full hearts. Vivian, he breathed against her skin, and her name had never sounded like such a prayer. She pulled him closer, their bodies finding the rhythm they had never quite forgotten, and for the first time in 5 years, she felt whole. Not because he completed her, she had learned the hard way that no one could do that, but because she was finally with him. When they finally came apart, breathless and tangled together, Jasper pressed his forehead to hers in the darkness. Stay, he whispered. I'm not going anywhere, she promised. And this time, she meant it. Vivian woke to sunlight and the unfamiliar weight of another person in her bed. Then she felt Jasper's arm across her waist, his breath against her neck, and the previous night came rushing back. She lay still, afraid any movement might shatter what they'd found. His arm tightened. He shifted awake. For a long moment, neither spoke. Hi, Jasper said finally, voice rough with sleep. Hi, Vivian whispered back. He pressed a kiss to her bare shoulder. Are you okay? She turned to face him. He looked younger like this, defenses down. I don't know. Are you? I don't know, either. He traced her jaw. But I'm here. And I want to be here. What happens now? His thumb brushed her cheekbone. I want to try again. Not like 5 years ago, all intensity, no ground. Something real this time. Something we build deliberately. I don't know if I know how. Last time I was so afraid of losing you, I made it happen. Then we figure it out together. He shifted closer. We talk about the hard things. Don't make decisions for each other. We're honest, even when it's uncomfortable. Relief washed through her. I'm afraid. Of hurting you again. Of not being enough. I'm afraid, too. That you'll run. That I'll try to control everything. That we'll focus so much on the past. We'll forget to build a future. So what do? We try anyway. He kissed her forehead. We set boundaries. Communicate. Don't let fear decide. We show up, even when it's hard. Tears slid down her face. I don't want to lose you again. Then don't leave, he said simply. Stay. Fight. Tell me when you're scared instead of running. She nodded against his chest. Okay, I'll try. They lay in comfortable silence, morning light growing stronger. Eventually, he spoke again. I've cut my family off completely. Not just from business, from everything. I haven't spoken to my father or brother since I found out what they did, and I don't plan to. She pulled back. Jasper, you don't have to. They threatened you once, trapped you with contracts, made you go through the worst alone. I won't risk it again. He cupped her face. Listen carefully. You are not the reason I cut them off. Their actions are. The cruelty, the manipulation. That's on them, not you. The certainty in his eyes was absolute. One day at a time? She asked. One day at a time. He pulled her closer. They had a long way to go. But lying there in the morning light, the future no longer felt impossible. And this time, she wasn't going to run. Thank you for staying till the end. If you're still here, you're now part of the family. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. If you love dark romance stories, you shouldn't miss every story on this channel. Do you think Vivian was wrong to take the money? Tell me what you think in the comment below.